T.S. Eliot is considered to be perhaps one of the most important and one of the most significant voices of the modernist movement that swept across Europe and England in the first half of the 20th century. T.S. Eliot revitalized the very language of poetry. The kind of form, the kind of imagist formations in poetry that he brought was indeed something which was revolutionary in English poetry at that point of time. We must remember that T.S. Eliot was heavily influenced by the French imagist poets of the 19th century. In one of the essays, Eliot had observed that he was influenced by Laforgue than any other poet in any other language, which is evidence enough that Eliot was very much influenced by poets like Baudelaire, Laforgue, and Mallarmé. And the reason why Eliot was influenced by those poets was because Eliot could not find a proper poet in English who could influence him. Eliot was always searching for a language that would capture the essence of disillusionment and the fragmentation of the post-war Europe. Eliot started his career with his collection of poems called the Poems 1920, where he had poems like Prufrock, but his most important poem, of course, is The Wasteland, which is considered to be an epic of the modern civilization, published in 1922. Eliot was guided by his senior poet, Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound had formed, or should I say that he founded, the Imagist school of poetry, where Ezra Pound was talking about concretizing the images of poetry to such an extent where images would capture the entire essence of the poetic thought. This kind of imagism is also found in a poem like The Wasteland, where we see that the images capture the essence of the sheer waste, disillusionment, alienation, ennui, and loneliness of the modern civilization. Images like the waste papers and the waste objects lying beside the Thames River, the taxi throbbing and waiting, the image of a lover coming in to have a sexual intercourse with his beloved without any sense of emotional attachment, all reflect a modern civilization which has become literally a waste, with full of complete meaninglessness. The entire poem, The Wasteland, is filled with images of impotency. The king, Tiresias, is present in the poem as a bridge between the classical times and the modern times. But what we see is that Tiresias is blind and he is impotent in the sense that he is cursed by the Greek gods, and therefore he is in between a man and a woman. He becomes a kind of a metaphor of the kind of impotency that Eliot was trying to replicate and represent in his poetry, The Wasteland. In The Wasteland, what we also see are images of nervy disillusionment. The Wastelanders are nervy. They suffer from nerve disorders. And that is because they suffer from a state of neurasthenic alienation, where they are completely separated from the unity of their being. And therefore, when the speaker of the poem talks about a shadowy third person walking beside him, the readers are made aware of the fact that even Jesus has become a shadowy presence in a wasteland, that is without any faith and is desperately waiting for some hope to come. Some hope is found in Eliot's love, Eliot's attraction towards the Eastern mysticism, and that is why we see that Eliot was drawn to poets like W.B. Yeats and to philosophers like Schopenhauer, and Eliot includes some of the tenets of the Upanishads, the Vedas, like the Dayadham and the Damyata, in order to reflect upon the Shanti, the absolute peace that is needed to restore the order and the faith in the wasteland. This kind of burning hell that Eliot represents in his poetry is also influenced by Dante's reflection of hell in Inferno. In fact, in Eliot's private tradition, Dante is one of the major poets. After this, Eliot wrote quite a few other poems as well, like The Hollow Man. But in 1927, Eliot got himself initiated to Catholic order, to the Catholic order. In fact, he became a member of the Anglo-Catholic Church, which settled down Eliot emotionally and mentally. At this point of time, he also got himself divorced from his schizophrenic wife, Vivienne Eliot. And so, from 1927 onwards, what we see is that Eliot's poetry takes a decidedly Christian turn, where Eliot finds faith, where Eliot finds peace, where Eliot finds spiritual solace in the Christian indoctrinations. In this phase, his poems include the Ash Wednesday, the Four Quartets, Marina. And Eliot also wrote some major poetic plays at this phase of his career, and he turned to theatre as a mode to express his individual Christian settlement. At this phase, we see that Eliot writes plays like Murder in the Cathedral, which talks about the historical martyrdom of Thomas Becket, who was murdered in 1170 by the men of the then king. And he was murdered because Becket did not agree with the king's policies. He wanted to have an autonomous power of the church. This historical event becomes the setting, becomes the story for Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral. And this particular play, which was commissioned by the church and was written by Eliot and staged in the year 1935, this play shows how Becket moves beyond the temptations not only of his past, but his own spiritual temptation to become a martyr. And this play essentially is about Thomas Becket moving beyond the Hall of Mirrors in order to arrive at a spiritual recognition that he cannot become a martyr. A martyr can only become a martyr when that is willed by God. And that is what Thomas Becket realizes through his inquest, through his spiritual journey, and therefore he submits his will to the will of God. As Dante would have prescribed, La sua voluntate e nostra pace, our peace is in his will. Later on, Eliot also wrote plays like The Rock, The Family Reunion, and The Cocktail Party. These plays are more Buddhist in their philosophical representations. In plays like The Family Reunion, we see the protagonist, like Harry, chooses to lead his life according to the middle path which is prescribed by Buddha. And in this play, what we see is that how these characters in the play, they move beyond the material temptations of their life, and they arrive at a certain recognition of their spiritual self, which is essentially the journey that Eliot has had as a poet as well. Eliot was also a major critic. His most important, should I say that his most well known essays are The Tradition and Individual Talent, The Metaphysical Poets. He wrote many essays on Laforgue, on Baudelaire, and Dante. And very interestingly, Eliot also wrote essays on some of the so called decadent Elizabethan playwrights like Thomas Middleton and Dekker. Eliot always gave importance to the idea of his private tradition. And Eliot was of the point of view that tradition, literary tradition is something, or cultural tradition is something which cannot be imposed upon the poet. A poet has to read, struggle, and find his own voice in the tradition he chooses to follow. So therefore, Eliot's tradition included poets like Dante and the metaphysical poets, and poets like Laforgue and Baudelaire, but Shakespeare and Milton did not form a part of Eliot's tradition, which is indeed a revolution by its own intellectual content. Later on, Eliot wrote essays like To Criticize a Critic, where he called himself a poet critic. So, in an essay like On Poetry and Criticism, Eliot observed that his essays are a byproduct of his poetry. In fact, his essays are a part of his private poetry workshop. The last essays that Eliot wrote before he won the Nobel Prize in the late 1940s, these essays were more cultural in intent than literary. He wrote essays like The Christian Society and the others, where he was talking about the necessity to bind Europe together on the ideals of Christianity, which was always the case according to Eliot. So Eliot's essays later on, like his poetry, turned towards Christianity in order to find an identity within the European construct. And he always felt that it is in classicism that Europe would find its lost cultural unity. Eliot called himself a classicist in poetry. And this is the kind of classicism that Eliot followed, because it is in classicism that he felt that the European unity, the European Christian identity, the European cultural and literary identity lies.